In the vast expanse of the galaxy, the strongest warriors had always held a reputation of invincibility. Across countless planets and in the cold depths of space, their names were whispered with both fear and respect. These warriors had fought through battles that spanned centuries, clashing with alien species, rival empires, and even the very elements of space itself. Every encounter had only further solidified their dominance, and their strength seemed unmatched by any known force. Each of these warriors had a history that was carved into the stars themselves. It was said that they were born from the fire of conflict and tempered in the darkest corners of space. They had the power to destroy entire fleets with a single command, to crush the mightiest enemies with just their hands. These warriors were legends, and legends were what the galaxy feared. They controlled the fate of the galaxy's many systems and dictated the rise and fall of civilizations. They lived by a simple code: strength above all and conquest at any cost. But as they looked toward the horizon of the galaxy, a new presence began to emerge. A presence that even the most powerful warriors couldn't ignore. A fleet, unlike any they had ever encountered, appeared on the edges of the galaxy. The ships of this fleet were massive, their hulls glowing with an eerie, unearthly light. The warriors watched in silence as the fleet moved, its purpose unclear. There were no signs of weapons, no flashing lights of a battle-ready force, and yet something about these ships filled the air with an unsettling calm. The galaxy's greatest warriors, who were so used to being in control, felt a strange sense of helplessness as the unknown fleet drew closer. At first, the warriors thought it might be a mere mistake, perhaps a lost convoy or a group of explorers from some forgotten part of the universe. But the longer they watched, the more they realized that this was something different. This fleet did not follow the rules of space warfare. It did not send out messages demanding surrender or threatening annihilation. There was no aggression. There was no challenge. It simply watched. The warriors of the galaxy, those who had conquered countless enemies, could not make sense of this. The greatest minds, the most cunning generals, the fiercest fighters, all were confused. What could this fleet possibly be? And why were they not responding to the overwhelming force of the galaxy's most powerful warriors? Days passed, and still, the fleet did not move. It simply hovered at the edge of the galaxy, watching, waiting. The warriors' frustration grew. They sent out fleets of their own to engage the strange invaders. Battle plans were drawn up with precision. The forces of the galaxy's strongest fighters were ready. Every possibility was considered, every counter-strategy prepared. But as the fleets of the galaxy's warriors approached, they were met with an eerie silence. No weapons fired, no lasers blinked in the vastness of space. The strange ships didn't even attempt to defend themselves, yet they did not fall. And no matter how much the warriors tried, no matter how many ships they sent or strategies they employed, they could not break through the defenses of the unknown fleet. The warriors were stumped. They had dealt with invaders before, beasts, armies, and even other civilizations that sought to destroy them. But this was different. There was no fight, no resistance, in the usual sense. The invaders didn't care to destroy or conquer. They didn't seem interested in war. Instead, they simply watched. The galaxy's greatest warriors had their moments of triumph, of glory. They had built their reputation through battles, conquests, and victories over every enemy that had dared to challenge them. But now, as they faced these unknown invaders, something far more powerful than any weapon they had ever used confronted them. Silence. What were these invaders? What were they waiting for? The galaxy's warriors had never known a battle like this. They had never been in the position of not knowing what their opponent wanted, and that, more than anything, unnerved them. It wasn't long before the strongest among them, Korath, the Red Hand, the fiercest warrior the galaxy had ever known, decided to take action. Korath was a living legend, a symbol of strength and power. It was said that no one could match his skill in combat. No army could defeat him. No rival could match his rage. He was the galaxy's ultimate fighter. Korath had conquered worlds, toppled empires, and slain monsters from the depths of space. He was a hero, a leader, and a symbol of power. The galaxy's greatest warriors followed him, trusted him, and believed that as long as he was in charge, there was no force they could not overcome. But even Korath could not deny the strange presence that filled the galaxy. As the days wore on, he found himself unable to focus on anything else. He stared into the distance, watching the silent fleet, knowing that his next move would determine the future of the galaxy. Would he be able to defeat this strange enemy? Or would he too be consumed by the silence that seemed to swallow the stars themselves? Korath gathered his most trusted commanders and prepared to lead a fleet against the invaders. His plan was simple: engage the fleet head-on, break through their defenses, and capture whatever technology they held. There would be no negotiation. There would be no mercy. The invaders would be destroyed, and their ships would be his to command. As Korath's fleet moved toward the unknown, the silence only deepened. The invaders did not move, did not react. It was as though they knew what was coming, but chose not to respond. This unsettling calm only made the warriors more anxious, more determined. It was time for action. It was time to prove that no force in the galaxy was beyond their reach. But the moment Korath's fleet came within range, something incredible happened. The invaders did not fire. They did not engage in battle. Instead, Korath's fleet seemed to disappear. One by one, his ships vanished without a trace, as though they had never existed in the first place. No explosions, no debris, just the sudden and complete absence of his forces. Korath himself found himself standing in the vast emptiness of space, alone. The invaders had not destroyed his fleet. They had not fired a single shot. Instead, they had erased them from existence. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been altered, leaving nothing behind. Korath was stunned. For the first time in his life, he felt a deep sense of fear. This was not a battle he could win with strength alone. There was no enemy to fight, no ships to engage. The invaders had done nothing but erase the warriors from existence, without lifting a finger. He felt a presence then, a weight on his mind, an overwhelming sensation of being watched. But there were no eyes, no faces, no bodies to see. It was just the silence. And then, for the first time, Korath understood. The invaders weren't here to fight. They weren't here to conquer. They had come to test the warriors. They had come to see if strength alone could ever truly dominate the galaxy. If the warriors could learn to evolve, to face a challenge that didn't require bloodshed. But Korath wasn't sure if he was ready to face such a challenge, and as the silence stretched on, he realized that the galaxy's greatest warriors were no longer the ones who had the power to destroy. They were the ones who would have to learn to adapt, to grow, and perhaps to finally embrace the silence that had come to change everything. The galaxy was still reeling from the events that had unfolded when Korath and his fleet disappeared without a trace. The great warriors, who had once believed in their own invincibility, now stood in awe of the silence that had taken over the galaxy. There was no longer any sense of control, no war cries or booming battles. The very force that had brought them to the peak of power was now useless, for the enemy they faced was not one that could be fought with weapons or strength alone. Korath stood alone in the vastness of space, surrounded by nothing but the empty void. The fleet he had commanded, the ships he had led into battle, were gone, vanished. And though he was still physically present, he felt smaller than ever before. The power that had once flowed through him like a storm now felt like a distant memory. The silence around him was deafening, but it was not the silence of an empty battlefield. It was the silence of something far greater. Korath could feel it, deep within him. The invaders were watching, observing. But they did not act. They did not move. They remained still, distant, and unfathomable. The warriors who had once been the mightiest in the galaxy were now unsure of themselves. They had been built on strength, on battle, on the power of conquest. But none of that mattered now. They had faced enemies, creatures, and armies that were fierce and deadly, but all of them had been defeated. Their greatest weapon was their own might. Yet now, in the face of this unknown force, their power meant nothing. Days passed without any sign of movement from the invaders. The galaxy's warriors, those who had once commanded entire fleets, found themselves without a purpose. They were unsure of how to proceed. The power they once relied on seemed insignificant, and they were left to ponder the reason for the invaders' strange silence. Across the galaxy, whispers began to spread. The strongest among them, those who had once been invulnerable, gathered in secret. The once unbreakable leaders now faced the cold truth. They were no longer the top of the food chain, no longer the masters of the stars. They discussed plans. They debated. Some of the bravest tried to fight, sending out smaller fleets, hoping that this time they could break the deadlock. But with every move, they were met with the same eerie calm. They couldn't understand it. The fleets would disappear again, swallowed by nothingness, vanishing as if they had never existed. One by one, the great warriors began to withdraw from the conflict. They could not fight what they could not understand. There were no clear battles to wage, no territories to conquer, no generals to defeat. The invaders offered no resistance in the traditional sense. There were no weapons to fire, no armies to crush. The silence remained, and with it, the growing sense of helplessness. Korath, however, would not give up. He could not. He had spent his entire life conquering. His name was known across the galaxy, his reputation forged in the blood of countless enemies. He had always been the one who led, the one who fought until the end. But this was something different. He was not foolish enough to attack again without understanding the situation. But he could not just stand by and do nothing. He gathered his remaining allies, the warriors who had remained by his side, and told them of his plan. He would go deeper into the unknown space, closer to the source of this mysterious fleet. He would find out what they were, what they wanted, and why they had come. Korath's fleet, now much smaller than before, began its journey toward the heart of the silent enemy. His crew followed him with a mixture of fear and determination. No one knew what to expect, but they trusted Korath. They had seen him face impossible odds before, and they believed that with him leading them, there was still a chance. As they approached the heart of the unknown, the silence seemed to grow even more oppressive. The ships of the invaders, massive and glowing with strange energy, continued to hover in place. No signals, no signs of aggression, no attempt at communication. Just stillness. The warriors in Korath's fleet could feel the weight of that silence pressing in on them. It was not just a lack of sound. It was the absence of life, of purpose. It was as if time itself had come to a standstill. Korath stood at the helm of his ship, his mind racing. He was no stranger to the concept of strategy, but this situation was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The enemy's technology was beyond comprehension, and their tactics were a mystery. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He gave the order to move forward, and his fleet pressed deeper into the heart of the silent fleet. The invaders did not react. No weapons were raised, no shields were activated. They simply watched, their presence hanging like a shadow over the warriors. Hours passed, then days. Still, the invaders remained silent, their fleet unyielding. Korath began to feel the weight of uncertainty pressing on him. How much longer could they wait? How long could they stand in the face of this quiet menace? It wasn't until the fourth day that something finally happened. Korath's fleet, which had been carefully advancing toward the unknown, suddenly found itself surrounded. The ships of the invaders, which had been stationary for so long, began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately, they closed in on Korath's fleet. There were no explosions, no blinding lights, just the steady, unhurried movement of the silent ships. Korath gave the order to prepare for combat. His warriors readied their weapons, their hearts racing with adrenaline. Finally, they would face the enemy. Finally, there would be a fight. They were ready to destroy, to fight for their survival. But as the ships closed in, something strange happened. The invaders did not attack. Instead, the space around Korath's fleet seemed to distort. The ships began to flicker, as if reality itself was warping. The warriors watched in confusion as their surroundings shifted, as though the very fabric of space was unraveling before their eyes. The silence was still there, but now there was something more. The warriors felt a pull, a sense of being drawn into something vast and incomprehensible. It was as if the invaders were not just observing them, but pulling them into a different realm, a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. Korath stood frozen, his mind racing. What was happening? What kind of power did these invaders possess? Were they even real? Or was this some kind of illusion, some trick that he could not yet understand? And then, as quickly as it had begun, the distortion stopped. The ships of the invaders hovered once more, motionless in the void. The silence returned, but now it felt different. It felt as if the very air itself was thick with questions, with answers that had yet to be revealed. Korath was no longer sure of what to do. He had led his warriors into battle countless times, but this was no battle. There was no fight to be won. There was only the silence and the strange power that had gripped them all. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice that seemed to come from everywhere, and yet from nowhere at all. It was calm, soothing, and yet it carried an undeniable weight. The voice spoke to Korath and his warriors, as if it had always known them, as if it had been waiting for them to arrive.
"We are not your enemies," the voice said. "We are not here to destroy you.
We are here to test you." The warriors exchanged uneasy glances, but Korath stood tall, his resolve hardening. The test, he realized, had already begun. And whether he was ready for it or not, he would have to face whatever challenge lay ahead. Korath stood in the heart of the vast empty space, his mind racing with confusion and a growing sense of unease. The voice, calm and deep, had spoken to him and his warriors, telling them that they were not the enemy, that there was no fight to be had. The invaders, if they could even be called that, had made it clear that their purpose was not to destroy. They had no interest in conquest, no desire for war. They were here for something else, something more. "We are here to test you," the voice had said, leaving Kore with 1,000 questions, none of which had answers. He had heard many things in his long years of battle, cries of fear, shouts of victory, orders given in the heat of combat, but never had he heard anything like this. This was no enemy demanding submission. This was a force beyond anything he had ever encountered, something that did not need to prove its strength through violence. His fleet was still hovering, its crew awaiting his command. The warriors who had once stood by him, invincible in their own right, were now filled with uncertainty. Their pride had been shattered, their confidence shaken by this new and mysterious force. They had always known their place in the galaxy, always understood their power. But now they were faced with something that could not be defeated with force, with weapons, or even with the might of their collective will. The invaders were beyond them, beyond anyone. Korath's hand gripped the rail in front of him as he stared out into the deep void of space. The ships of the invaders remained still, their vast forms almost serene in the stillness. The eerie glow from their hulls reflected off the cold emptiness of space, and the warriors could feel the strange pressure building within them, as if the very air was charged with a power they could not comprehend. "What do they want from us?" one of Korath's most trusted commanders, Rake asked quietly, his voice filled with uncertainty. He had fought beside Korath for years, his loyalty unwavering, his strength unmatched. But now, in the face of this silence, he, too, was lost. There was no war to be fought, no strategy to devise. There was only the strange, unyielding presence of the invaders, watching them, waiting. Korath turned to face Rake, his expression grim. "I don't know," he admitted, "but we will find out." The voice had been clear, but its meaning was still a mystery. A test. That was what they had said. A test for what? For whom? Korath had no answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't allow this strange force to challenge them without understanding why. He had spent his entire life fighting for control, for dominance. He couldn't allow his warriors, or himself, to be defeated by something they didn't understand. "We have always fought," Korath said, his voice low, but firm. "We fight for power, for strength, for survival. But now we face something that doesn't play by those rules. This isn't a battle of strength. It's something else. Something deeper. And we will not back down." Rake nodded, though the doubt in his eyes was still visible. "But how do we fight what we can't see?" he asked. "How do we fight an enemy that doesn't show itself?" Korath didn't have an answer. There was no obvious way to confront this challenge. No strategy they had used before would work now. And yet, Korath felt a strange stirring deep inside him. He had always known that the greatest strength didn't come from the sword or the gun. It came from within. It came from the ability to adapt, to change, to rise above the limitations of physical power. He turned back toward the silent fleet, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and determination. He had always been a warrior, trained for battle, tempered by war. But now, he realized, his true test was not in fighting. It was in understanding. "We must learn," Korath muttered to himself. "We must understand what they want, and we must show them that we are worthy of this test." The invaders had not attacked. They had not launched any weapons or made any moves toward them. They had done nothing but observe, and that, Korath realized, was the key. They were not interested in war, in violence. They were interested in something else, something that the galaxy's greatest warriors had long forgotten: the ability to evolve. Days passed as Korath's fleet remained suspended in the silent void. There were no signs of attack, no sudden movements, just the stillness, the growing weight of the unknown. And the warriors began to feel the pressure. Some of them, the younger ones who had never known anything but conflict, grew restless. They had been trained to fight, to destroy, to conquer. And yet now, they were left with nothing to fight against. But Kore refused to give in to that restlessness. He refused to allow his warriors to lose faith. He gathered his commanders once more, and they began to discuss their options. It became clear that there was no immediate action to take, no direct response to the invaders' presence. They would have to wait, and watch, just as the invaders had done. As the silence continued, something began to change within Korath. The anger, the frustration, the need to fight, he could feel them all receding. They were being replaced by a quiet resolve. He began to understand, slowly, that the true strength of a warrior was not in the ability to fight, but in the ability to stand still, to endure, to remain calm in the face of uncertainty. It wasn't until the 5th day that something finally happened. A strange, shimmering light appeared in the distance. It was faint at first, barely visible against the backdrop of space, but it grew stronger, brighter, until it consumed the space around Korath's fleet. The warriors gasped in surprise as the light enveloped them, and for a moment it seemed as if they had been transported to another place entirely. The light was not blinding, but it was overwhelming, as if it were more than just light. It was energy, life itself. Korath felt it, deep within him, a surge of something powerful, something ancient. The energy washed over him, filling him with a sense of clarity he had never known before. And then, the voice returned. "You have passed the first test," it said, its tone softer now, almost comforting.
You have withstood the silence. You have waited without fear, without hesitation.
But this is only the beginning. The warriors stood still, their hearts pounding in their chests. The voice was not hostile, not threatening. It was simply knowing. It understood them in a way no one else ever had, and yet it was still a mystery. The questions continued to swirl in Korath's mind, but now they were not filled with fear or uncertainty. They were filled with curiosity. "What is the test?" Korath asked, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. The voice responded, its tone calm and wise. "The test is not about strength. It is not about power. It is about understanding. Understanding that the greatest strength is not in conquering others, but in conquering oneself. The greatest warriors are not those who can destroy, but those who can evolve." Korath felt a strange peace wash over him. The voice had given him something to hold on to. A new understanding. A new purpose. He had spent his life fighting for power, for control. But now he understood that true power came from within, from the ability to change, to adapt. As the light began to fade, Korath's fleet found themselves once again surrounded by the silent ships of the invaders. But this time, Korath did not feel fear. He did not feel the need to fight. He simply stood, waiting, watching, and for the first time in his life, he felt the true strength of a warrior. The silence had lasted for days now. Korath, the Red Hand, stood at the edge of the vast emptiness, his fleet behind him, but all of them still and silent as they hovered near the strange fleet of invaders. No battles had been fought, no shots fired. There had been no explosions, no cries of victory or defeat. There had only been the stillness, the weight of the unknown pressing against their hearts, their minds, and their souls. Korath had faced many challenges in his life, but none had been like this. In his many years of battle, he had learned to expect violence, to expect conflict, to know the rules of war and follow them. But this was not war. This was something different, something that he could not fight with weapons, with force, or with any of the usual tools of a warrior, and that truth had shaken him to his core. As he stood there, surrounded by his warriors, the eerie calm of the invaders washed over him again. They had not moved. They had not threatened him or his fleet. They had simply waited, silent and patient. It was as though they were watching, waiting for something to unfold. But what? What were they waiting for? He could feel the tension building within his warriors. They were used to fighting. Moray, they were used to conquering. But here, in the presence of these silent invaders, they were helpless. There was no enemy to fight, no army to crush. They had been trained to fight, to destroy. But now they were unsure of how to move forward. Korath looked at his warriors, his comrades, the fighters who had stood beside him in countless battles. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the confusion. They were still warriors, but they had no way of knowing how to face this challenge. They had always relied on their strength, on their skill, on their ability to defeat whatever came before them. But this was different. This was not something to be defeated. He could feel the pressure of their expectations on him. They looked to him for guidance, for leadership, for answers. But how could he give them answers when he didn't have any himself? What was this test? What was it that the invaders wanted from them? The voice had spoken to them before, saying that they were not the enemy, that they were here to test them. But Korath still didn't understand what the test was, and he didn't know how to pass it. The invaders had not asked them to fight. They had not demanded submission. They had not come to destroy. Instead, they had come to watch, to observe, to see how the greatest warriors in the galaxy would respond to a challenge unlike any they had ever faced. As the days passed, Korath's mind began to shift. He had always believed that strength was the key to victory, that the power to conquer was what made a true warrior. But now he wasn't so sure. The invaders had shown him that there was more to strength than just physical power. There was something deeper, something that went beyond fighting, beyond domination. Korath looked out at the silent fleet once more. the massive ships hanging in the emptiness like silent sentinels. They were watching him, waiting. He could feel it, the weight of their gaze. And yet, he didn't feel anger or fear. He felt something else, something he had never felt before. It was a strange kind of peace. The warriors in his fleet were restless. They had come here to fight, to win, to prove their strength. But now, they were unsure. They were lost in the silence. Korath could see the frustration building within them. They were warriors, not philosophers. They didn't understand what this test was, and they didn't know how to face it. But Korath knew that he had to find a way. He could not allow his warriors to falter. He could not let them lose faith. He had led them through countless battles, and now he would lead them through this. He had to find a way to pass the test, to prove that they were worthy of whatever came next. And then, one day, it happened. The silence was broken. The light appeared again, the shimmering, glowing energy that had surrounded them before. This time, however, it was different. It wasn't just light. It was warmth, a presence that filled the void of space. The warriors felt it too, an overwhelming sense of being enveloped, of being touched by something greater than themselves. Korath stood tall, his hands clenched into fists, but there was no anger in him now. The presence was not threatening. It was not demanding. It was simply there, a part of the universe itself, as if something ancient and powerful had reached out to touch them. The voice spoke again, but this time it was softer, almost kind. You have come far, Korath. You have withstood the silence. You have stood in the face of uncertainty and doubt, and you have not faltered. But the true test is not in your strength. It is not in your ability to conquer. The true test is in your ability to choose. Korath's heart raced as the voice spoke these words. What did it mean? What choice? He had been a warrior all his life. He had fought for control, for victory. He had always believed that strength was the answer. But now, he was being asked to choose. Choose what? The greatest warriors are not those who conquer others? The voice continued. They are those who conquer themselves. They are those who understand that true strength comes not from the power to destroy, but from the power to choose. The power to choose peace, to choose wisdom, to choose to evolve. Korath's mind was spinning. He had never thought of it this way before. He had always fought, always sought to conquer. He had believed that strength was the ultimate goal, the ultimate measure of a warrior. But now, the voice was telling him that there was something more. There was a deeper strength, a strength that came from within, from the ability to choose. The voice paused for a moment, and Korath could feel the weight of the silence again. But this time, it wasn't oppressive, it was inviting. It was as though the universe itself was offering him something greater than he had ever known. The choice is yours, Korath, the voice said. Will you continue to fight for domination? Will you continue to seek power through violence and conquest? Or will you choose to evolve? Will you choose to rise above your past, to embrace a new path? The path of wisdom, of understanding, of peace. Korath stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. He had spent his entire life fighting, conquering, destroying. It was all he had ever known. But now, he was being asked to choose something else, something that seemed so foreign, so alien to him. The voice spoke again, this time softer, more gentle. You are not alone in this, Korath. You have your warriors, your comrades. They too will face this choice. Will you lead them down the path of war, or will you lead them to something greater? Korath closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He thought of his warriors, his comrades who had stood by him through every battle, every war. They had trusted him, followed him, believed in him, and now they were looking to him again. They were waiting for him to make the choice. He thought of all the battles he had fought, all the lives he had taken, all the destruction he had caused. And he realized deep down that he no longer wanted to be that man. He didn't want to be the warrior who fought only for power, for domination. He wanted something more. He wanted peace, wisdom, understanding. He wanted to evolve. Korath opened his eyes and looked out at the silent fleet, the ships of the invaders. They were not his enemies. They were not here to destroy him. They were here to show him something greater. And now he understood. The test was not just for him. It was for all of them. He turned to his warriors, who stood behind him, watching him, waiting for him to make the decision. And then, with a steady voice, Korath spoke. "We will not fight," he said. "We will not seek to conquer. We will choose to evolve. We will embrace the wisdom that has been shown to us. We will choose peace." And in that moment, the silence that had once weighed heavily on him became a voice that spoke of hope, of growth, of a new beginning. The greatest warriors in the galaxy had made their choice. They had chosen to evolve.